Well, welcome back to Wednesday Night Live, coming to you from Pocatello, Idaho, in the beautiful Portneuf Valley, the gateway to the Great Northwest. We have a special edition of Wednesday Night Live tonight. We're going to interview someone who's running for office. I think you'll find it interesting. But before we do that, I want to do as I do every week at this time. I want to remind you about Compassion and Hope Pregnancy Center. I've told you many times about these folks. Remember, if you're out of state, the area code in this area is 208. That's for the whole state of Idaho. And you can reach Compassion and Hope Pregnancy Center at 478-HOPE. And as I've mentioned also, Compassion and Hope Pregnancy Center is the antithesis of everything Planned Parenthood stands for. In other words, Compassion and Hope stands for life. So if you think that you might be able to help save a life or bring a new life into the world, help somebody who's giving life, please consider 478-HOPE, Compassion and Hope. Give them a call. Find out if there's something you can do. Financially or otherwise, they would welcome any help you can give them. They operate on a very short shoestring, so anything you could do would be a great help to them. We're not going to take a whole lot of time getting into the show. I just, I realize that you're here because you could be watching reruns of Bowling for Dollars and you're not. So we really appreciate your being here tonight. And I think you'll appreciate the information you're going to get. A quick note, tomorrow at the rendezvous at the Idaho State University from 6 until 8 p.m. there will be a Bannock County GOP meet and greet for candidates who are running for office. And you know, we're only about a month away now, not quite a month away from the elections. So tomorrow at the rendezvous at ISU from 6 p.m. till 8 p.m. a meet and greet for the candidates. If you're, get done with dinner in time or however you want to work that, come by after work. Go by and meet and greet with some of the candidates for office. And with that, I think we'll get into the very special interview. Now, what you're going to see is what they call canned, because the man we're interviewing tonight is Senator Russ Fulcher, who is running for the office of governor. And Russ was coming through town and on a road trip, so to speak. And we were able to snag him last Friday. We couldn't get him here tonight, so we actually interviewed him this past Friday, and we had what I thought was a very good conversation. I'll let you be the judge, but are we good to go on that, Josh? Please watch this. Well, as I said at the beginning of the program, we're doing a special edition this afternoon, and I am so delighted to have an in-studio guest who is, we have become friends. I got to meet him actually several years ago, and then when he started campaigning, we got a chance to renew our association, and we've become friends since then. So disclaimer, I'm interviewing a friend, so I'm going to try to be nice, but I am so delighted that you're able to join us this evening, and I'm even more delighted to be able to welcome our special guest, Senator Russ Fulcher.
Thank you, my friend.
Thank you so much for being here.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Just a delight. Senator Fulcher is on the road, and he's got a very short time period here, so we're going to just get as much in this space as we can and squeeze as much out of you as we can.
I'll do my best.
Yeah, this is all going to be old hat because, as a governor, you get squeezed all the time anyway.
Well, that's okay. It's worth it. It's worth it.
Now, Senator Fulcher, I'm going to, I've got some questions to ask you. That's just part of this. But I wanted to ask you primarily, just so we can get started off on the right foot, is would you tell us a little bit about, people up north and in the middle of the state know you pretty well, but down here you're not that well known.
Yeah.
So maybe you could tell us a little bit about who you are, your family, that kind of thing.
I'd love to. Thank you. And I'm a farm boy from Meridian, Idaho, with very, very deep roots there, fourth generation, and our family goes back to the 1800s in the Meridian area when there were dairy farms there, and I grew up on a dairy farm. We don't have dairy farms anymore there.
No.
So I knew that lifestyle was going away as a young man, and so I got involved I went through Idaho schools, Idaho primary, secondary schools, undergraduate, graduate school, engineering training, and I got involved in the technology industry. And I spent 24 years in the technology industry, traveling around the country and traveling around the world. And that gave me the opportunity to get a perspective on just how special it is in the state of Idaho and how special it is in America. And along the way, I met a fine young lady, and we've had 3 children, and they're all adults now.
Yeah, I was looking at this picture. What a beautiful family. Just really nice. I can't show you. I don't have a close-up camera, but great looking family.
In fact, not to segue too much, but one of the hardest things about this time in life is not only are we going through a statewide campaign, but all three of my kids have left home in the last year, and as a dad, I miss them.
Oh, yeah, oh, yeah.
But 24 years in the technology industry, traveling around the world for Idaho tech companies and working in that environment, it gives you a really good perspective on what works, what doesn't work, how other states and countries do things. I got involved in the state senate in 2005, and I just finished my 10th and last year in the Senate. Of those 10 years, 6 of them have been as caucus chairman, majority caucus chairman for the Senate. So my colleagues put me in a leadership role. And that gave me an opportunity to interact quite a bit with the governor's office for the last 3 governors, actually. And so to that end, that's just a little bit of a backdrop of who I am. And
that's good, too, because, you know, Idaho's a small state. There really aren't that many immigrants, so to speak. I mean, we get them. I'm an immigrant. I've only been here 8 years. But a lot of people from Idaho stay in Idaho, and they don't get that big picture that you've been able to accumulate through your years in the tech industry and your education. Of course, you were educated right here in Boise State, graduate.
Right.
And so that certainly, as the leader of the state's government, as the governor, it's good to have that the big picture, you know, the big picture of what it's like, what's the rest of the country thinking.
It's been life-changing for me.
Absolutely, yeah. And you haven't just been in this country, you've been around the world.
I think it's 46 countries.
Yeah, so you've got a pretty big perspective. And then I'm very impressed that with only 10 years, the last 6 years you've been the caucus chair. Is that probably?
Yeah, 6 of the last 10 years as majority caucus chairman.
That shows an awful lot of leadership and a lot of trust in your fellow office holders. So
it's a privilege to do that.
Yeah, that's pretty big. So I'm glad you shared that with us. Well, now as I said when we opened this segment, Senator Fulcher is on the road. I'm going to try to let him keep his schedule going, but we do have some questions, so you get a better chance to know who he is and what he stands for. We have kind of a reputation here in the southeast corner, rightly or wrongly, of being kind of, I don't know, liberal, I guess.
Yeah.
And but the folks that watch my program are pretty much conservative folks, and that wasn't to set you up to have the right conservative answers. I already know you.
Yeah.
But it's hard sometimes for a Republican in the other part of the state or other parts of the state to get down here to meet folks. So we'll talk a little bit about your take on various things. And I guess my first question would be, why now? Why are you ready to throw yourself into the fire now?
Ralph, it's a very good question, and there's a very solid answer for that. And it has to do with what's going on in our state right now on a couple of very, very major issues. 2 of the primary points of focus for me have to do with healthcare and have to do with education. And we're on a path right now that I believe is the wrong path on both of those. And there is a shelf life, there is a clock ticking on the implementation of 2 programs that I think are not good for our state, that need intervention and need to be redirected. And so that timing is largely driving my run for governor now.
Well, on your point, those are 2 big ones, because I guess we can say, I don't even know if there's a balancing act here, that one is equally as important as the other, but the one that is really putting the pressure on everybody in the state is Obamacare.
That's right.
And our governor, the current governor, showed some courage a few years and kind of stepped out front and said, no, that's not for us. And then for some reason he folded on it, and now he's become part of it, and I really don't understand that.
Well, let me share a perspective.
Please.
And with the legislature's support, he was on the front end of suing the federal government initially on the Affordable Care Act. But to your point, that has all reversed. And now, as of last year, Governor Otter led the charge for Idaho to be the only Republican-led state where the governor and the legislature are dominated by Republicans to voluntarily bring the Affordable Care Act into Idaho. And in my view, that was a devastatingly bad move. And the good news is that we can create an alternative. And that's what I want to do. I want to create an alternative path to the Affordable Care Act. And I want to have a private free market solution for that, where we can insert certain components, healthcare savings accounts, a charity care component, a direct pay component, health memberships, these types of things. And if we do that, and we can do that, we will create a superior solution to the Affordable Care Act. We will create a superior solution to the Obamacare exchange. People will naturally go there. And we will also drive costs down, because when you put the money in the hands of the people instead of the government,
Yes.
that's going to drive the cost down. That accountability, responsibility, we can do it. And that's going to be job number one.
And I think it scares the daylights out of a lot of us. I'm a senior citizen. I'm not really sure what's going to happen with my insurance, but with the Obamacare thing, with the so-called death panels, paying for things that I object to, like abortion and things like that, it's a mess. It's a real mess, and we need the leadership. And going back to current Governor Otter's reverse on this, it has caused an awful lot of angst here in the southeast corner of the state. One of our local senators and legislators have both been pushing real hard for this. They really like the idea, and a number of us don't. So I'm glad to see that someone's willing to step into the breach to speak for the rest of us, because somehow those of us that don't like the program but getting stuck with it anyway.
I would just think about for a moment Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security. These are all massive government programs that once they get initiated, once they get put in place, it's really difficult to unwind them. And that control shifts from the individual and from the family to the government. We can't let that happen. We've got to create an alternative, and we can do it here.
And not to beat it to death, but as has been said many times, Obamacare will, once it is fully implemented, and we don't know what that's going to look like. He's changed it every 2 or 3 weeks, or 2 or 3 days, but it will represent 1/6 of our gross national product, or the expense, the budget. 1/6. That means that basically the government has full control of us from that point on.
Single largest expansion of government in our lifetimes is the Affordable Care Act. We relinquish that control, we're not going to get it back. We can't relinquish that control.
And a perfect example for me, and you're younger than I am, but certainly you're aware of this. I remember when LBJ put in Medicare and the Great Society.
Yes, right.
And how's that working out for us?
Yeah. Well, therein lies that government cost control, overrun, and so on.
Yeah, billions and billions, or maybe even trillions beyond what they said.
That's right.
They projected.
That's right.
Well, we might want to come back to that if you want to revisit it. The other item that you touched on, though, it's a hot button item, and that has to do with education. And one of the really big hot button items with people that I know is the Common Core. I have a book here. I don't know if you've seen this, and I won't ask you to read it now.
I've actually seen that book.
This is, without a doubt, the idea that our school children would be exposed to this, it's beyond anything I can comprehend. But the Common Core thing just scares the daylights out of me. And I was pleased to see that one of the things you are very much in favor of is school choice.
Oh, yes.
Yeah,
yes. Well, if I could just touch on the education landscape for a moment. It's not coincidental, I don't believe, that the federal government is making such moves on healthcare and education. Because if you control healthcare and you control education, you control that society. And we've all been exposed to federal programs in the past. You've heard of Race to the Top, Goals 2000, No Child Left Behind, now it's Common Core. These are all federal programs that have been developed somewhere other than Idaho, but yet imposed on all states now, in this case, is what the objective is. And there are differences in the students in Idaho versus Chicago, versus Virginia, versus California, versus Massachusetts. We need to have the ability, and we should have the ability, to educate our own kids. And that's ultimately my objective with education policy is I want Idahoans to control the education system for Idahoans. If you imagine for a moment that let's say you had a retail outlet for your business, or you had a car dealership, and you were mandated to sell your product, exactly the same product for exactly the same price, using exactly the same marketing methodology. What does that do for innovation, for creativity, for entrepreneurship? The answer is little to nothing.
Yeah, squashes it.
And so if you take a set of standards, and you put those same standards on Pocatello versus Meridian versus Riggins versus Sandpoint versus inner city Detroit, and you try to drive that commonality, it just doesn't work, number one. Number two, it's not the best thing for our students. We can outperform those other demographics. I believe it. We have got a value system here, a family structure here. We can outperform the rest of this nation with education. I don't want to be tied to a out-of-state standard. We need to empower our teachers. We need to empower our parents and our local school boards, and let those decisions be made locally.
You know, and I really appreciate that, Senator, because one of the things that, well, your one-size-fits-all covers that pretty well. There is hope, and I know you've seen this, but of course there were either I think it was 5 states that originally said we don't want it. They looked at it and they said, no, this isn't for us. I would have hoped we had been one of those, because we're pretty independent in Idaho, and
right.
That's one of the attractions when my wife and and my whole family settled here. I like that independent spirit. But recently, Indiana opted out.
Yes.
Oklahoma has opted out. I would really like to see us. We're a little late for taking the leadership on that, but we could certainly step out there in concert with them.
Well, the state of Indiana, with what I understand, I really like the approach they're taking, because they're saying, look, we don't want to be locked into any one particular standard. We want to set those standards ourselves, and we can. And there might be a piece of the Common Core curriculum that we adopt. There might be a piece of Utah's standards that we adopt, or Idaho standards, or Massachusetts standards. They want to have the ability, and they've taken the initiative to go out and put a best of class education system in place. That's a good idea. And you know, we don't have to develop everything here, but I want to be in control of it here. And so if Utah or Massachusetts or whomever comes up with something that we say, you know, our local school districts, our parents, our teachers say, you know what, that's really good, and that's something I think we should do here, that's wonderful, and vice versa. But you mentioned the school choice thing too. Yeah. And I want to just very quickly on that. That is innovation in education. Yeah. The charter school movement, the homeschool movement, the magnet schools, the private schools, that plethora of alternatives, that system of choice, that is an innovative step. And we've got a very healthy school innovation movement in Idaho, and I want to keep that going.
And you know, education is difficult enough as it is. It has become, it seems like every week we're learning there's some new social experiment that's going to be put into the school system. And now the educators who really just want to teach Dick and Jane how to read and how to add and subtract, now they have to figure out how they're going to apply this new social innovation that may be experimental, maybe it works elsewhere. And so the educators are already up against it. And I think it's as you've already said, don't want to steal your part, other than it's nice to be able to do it locally to what fits us here. My daughter homeschooled my grandchildren, and now 2 of them are off at university and they're doing very well. They may have done very well in the public school system, but the point was they had a choice, and she was able to teach them at their pace what she wanted them to have, and they've done very well. So
well, and nice similar in our family, we've done all 3. We've done homeschool, private school, and public school, and so we got I think a reasonably good feel for that. But ultimately, our children are our ultimate resource, and I certainly cannot accept the notion that someone other than my family or someone outside of our state is setting the curriculum and the standards for my kids. And I don't think that should be the case for Idahoans. We've got good parents here. We've got good teachers here. We need to empower them.
Well, what flies in Massachusetts may not fly for us here.
That's right. That's right.
Might be a different thing.
That's right.
You have done something that I really like. I mean, you've done a couple of things, but this is one that really caught my attention, because when we first came here, there were a couple of things that were completely new to us. My wife is from California. I'm a transplant from Chicago by way of California. But one of the things that we came out here, and we came to this city, and not by accident of birth. We chose to come here. But one of the things that caught our attention was the taxes are rather extreme compared to what we were compared to California, of all things. Now, that has changed. With the flood of undocumented people to California, they're sinking fast. They're way over the head.
Sure.
We haven't reached that. But so taxes was one, and one of the things that we really were surprised by was we pay tax on food products here. In California, they don't pay tax on food products. You do on dog food, that kind of thing, and then all of your other materials.
Sure.
And I see where it was you who led the charge on the tax credit.
That's right.
For us. And now, if I understood that correctly, you're trying to get the consumable food items out of the tax system altogether.
That's right. And that's a very good point. And just a very quick backdrop on that. In 2007, 2008, I think those were the years myself and one other representative started the process of putting the grocery tax credit in place. And the reason we did it in the form of a credit was we knew that it was a very big, there was a number of reasons, but we knew it was a very big jump. There was a big replacement of those revenues that we would have to absorb in the rest of the budget. So we staged it over the period of several years. Well, that's almost fully implemented now. And so every person that files an Idaho tax return at this point can get a credit back for what they would have paid in taxes on groceries. Well, now it's time to take that off at the till. And the tax on food is a very regressive tax. Everybody has to have food.
Right.
And so the most vulnerable have to pay that tax. And it's just a bad tax. And it's had an impact on our economy. Look at our border towns. If you go to Payette, there, for example, or Fruitland, there's not a big grocery outlet because everybody crosses over into Oregon to do their grocery shopping.
Sure.
And Driggs and other places near the border. And so it has a big economic impact. It's a regressive tax. It needs to be removed to the till. And by the way, when we put the grocery tax credit in place, Governor Otter vetoed that. We had to take it a second year and get enough support that we had a bulletproof bill with 2/3 in House and Senate before he signed it. And then this last year, I introduced that bill to remove it at the till. I couldn't even get a hearing. But yet we had, I think, 24 sponsors, Republican and Democrat on both sides, couldn't even get a hearing. And I would submit to you that it'll come around next year, and it didn't this year because my name was on it. And I'm in the middle of a very high-profile race this year.
Yes, you are.
So was there politics involved? In my opinion, absolutely yes. But the point is, I think we will be able to get that done eventually, and it should happen. We should remove the tax on groceries at the till.
Well, and I have to say, I'll speak for my audience. We appreciate your leadership on that.
Thank you.
That's a tough one, and I appreciate the fact that you're willing to stay in the fight.
Yeah, thank you.
It's easy to get knocked down a couple times and say, you know what, the heck with it. I believe in it, but it'll never work. So thank you. Well, let's see. There was one here. I'm kind of backtracking here, but there was an article. I went to your webpage because I wanted to get to know a little bit more about your positions on various things that are important to locally here. And I liked your response on this one thing. It was in the Idaho Statesman, I guess. No, Marty, I do not support Medicaid expansion. Would you like to talk about that a little bit?
Well, one of the things the Idaho Statesman has done in recent weeks is they've had an op-ed, Fulcher Otter op-ed, and one of the pieces of subject matter was Medicaid expansion, because the governor, our current governor, will not commit on this topic. And so I opened up my op-ed piece by saying I do not support Medicaid expansion. Well, there was a editorial writer in Lewiston who took it, who just seemed to like strike that and then made some statement that Fulcher is wishy-washy on Medicaid expansion. No, I'm not. I don't support expanding it, and I need to explain why.
Please.
First of all, the Medicaid system is broken, and I don't believe in expanding broken systems, number one. Number two, it's another massive shift of control to the government.
Yeah.
And I want our individuals, our families, our people to have the control over their health care and over their money, not the government. And we can do a much better job of providing those services if we take that alternative path. And I'll give you a couple examples. Right now, the state of Idaho pays about $65 million per year through what's called the CAT fund, or catastrophic fund. The counties will pay about, or the taxpayers through the county accounts for about half of it, and taxpayers through the state account for about the other half. And that goes into indigent care for the most part. And so when people stop by the emergency room at the local hospital for whatever purpose and they can't pay, that covers that cost. That's the most expensive delivery system that there is in our state, is through the emergency room channels. We have an alternative, or we can have an alternative to that. We can put in place or proliferate some of these clinics, healthcare clinics, in certain geographies around the state, and steer people who don't have life-threatening emergencies to those clinics. We can use that charity care component. We can fuel some of those with this CAT fund money that we already have. We don't need to raise taxes to do it, and we can deliver that care much more efficiently and much more cost-effective in that kind of a model than just waiting for people to go to the emergency room at the hospital for their care. And so I do not support Medicaid expansion. You may recall that was a mandatory component in the original Affordable Care Act.
Yes.
That piece did get struck down by the Supreme Court. Of course, the exchange was upheld through a backdoor tax, but that's another story. But it's another component of the Affordable Care Act. It's another release or transition of control to the government that once we forfeit, I don't think we ever see that back. So I don't want to relinquish that control. I want that control within the hands of the people. We can do it cheaper and better.
And it is a truism that once Uncle Sam gets a stamp on something, it's done. You're stuck
Sure.
with it forever.
Yep.
I don't think I can remember in my 49 plus years that ever having a tax go away.
Yeah, no, it's very difficult to unwind it once it gets put in place.
And I understand, well, under the Obamacare thing, and it's already affected us here, as you know, in our state. They are putting on something like 21,000 new IRS agents or something just for that area. We've already had to build the exchange here to basically do their job, spending our money. And one of the things that I was rather dismayed about is that Obama said that they were going to give us 3 years upfront money to do this. And of course, you never get free money. And as you know, in 3 years, and then it's our baby. Well, if we can't afford it and they had to give us money up front, how in the world would we afford it after that?
Well, Ralph, you bring up another good point, and I would just underscore that by reminding everyone that this so-called federal money isn't. The federal government is $18 trillion in debt. I am not a wealthy man, but I have more money in my wallet than the federal government does. And so here we are, we're dependent on that. It's debt money, and most people don't know that 36% of the state budget in Idaho comes through the federal government. 36%. We are dependent on that. And that's another topic. I don't know if we have time to get into it.
Oh, we have.
We need to break away from that fiscal dependency on the federal government. I don't know if now's an appropriate time to talk about that.
Oh, no, it is, absolutely.
And there is a good way to do it, okay? And it has to do with the resources that God gave us. It's called our lands, okay?
Yes.
And 62%, Ralph, of the land within the state of Idaho is controlled by the federal government. And basically what that means is we can't touch it. No. 62%. So we start off with 38%. And then even that becomes encroached upon with infringements, things like Environmental Protection Agency, the Endangered Species Act. How many have we seen now? Slick spot, peppergrass, spotted owl, sage grouse, wolves. And so even the 38% we have is encroached on, encroached on, encroached on. You take away a people's resources, you take away their wealth. You take away their wealth and their resources, you take away their ability to control their destiny. We do not have control of our destiny because we don't have access to our resources. Idaho is incredibly wealthy with timber, with natural gas, with minerals. We're incredibly wealthy. We can fuel the economic engine of the nation, not just our own state, but we're starving to death economically. We're starving to death in a room full of food because we don't have access to our resources. And so that's another critical component that for the sake of our economic future, we have got to aggressively drive to get access to the land that we're standing on. Now, I'm not talking about selling it off or taking it to the highest bidder. I'm talking about wise, environmental, economic management to leverage the wealth beneath our feet.
Yeah.
We do that, we can control our destiny. And we do that, that gives us the economic ability as we grow to start reducing that dependency on the federal government. And right now, we are hooked. It's like a narcotic. We are hooked on the narcotic of federal money dependency. We have to stage our way away from that for our sake and frankly for the federal government's sake too, because they cannot continue on this path. This is not sustainable. We've got to be driving towards this, and that's another one of the major components that I want to push forward.
You know, it kind of reminds me, a bad analogy perhaps, but it reminds me of being a teenager, going to my dad and saying, "Hey Dad, can I use the car tonight?" "Well, sure." "Can I get $5 for gas?" "Well, sure." "What's in it for me?
Yeah.
And how are you going to repay it?"
Yeah.
"Well, let's see. The next 3 weekends I've got this chore for you." "That doesn't add up, Dad." You know,
Yeah.
I still had to go to Dad.
Yeah.
He controls it, you know, and our uncle isn't supposed to be our dad. He's not even supposed to be our uncle. 62% of the state, and one of the things that I'm sure you've talked about it in Boise, but it came to my attention more or less recently, was that we've heard a lot about rare earths. And apparently we have one of the major sources of it that we're not even allowed to tap right here in our state. And so we have to go to the Chinese.
That's right.
To get our
right.
rare earth, which we use for telephones, satellites, everything else.
Once again, it's another dependency. We have the wealth here.
Yeah.
We have the resources. We have all the tools for our own prosperity. People wonder, how come Idaho is at the tops of the nation for having the highest percentage of minimum wage jobs per capita?
Mm-hmm.
Well, the reason is because we don't have control of our resources.
Yeah.
If you look at a map of the United States and you look at, if you were just to highlight all of the federal lands across the nation, what you would see is that the states on the eastern side of the Continental Divide have almost no federal lands. So states like Texas, North Dakota, their economies are thriving.
Yes.
Because they control their own resources. Now they have their own problems, don't get me wrong, but it's not economic generation because they have control of their lands. Idaho and the western states, for the most part, do not. And so we have been relegated to a minimum wage service type economy in this state. We wonder why we don't have more manufacturing jobs in timber. Well, it's because we won't let people touch and harvest the timber. We'd rather watch that go up in smoke and then fight it by spending taxpayer money to suppress fires.
It's almost like every year we can expect the fire season, and all the government is saying is, well, bring me weenies, bring me marshmallows, what a great fire. And it's our wealth going up in smoke.
It's going up in smoke. And that's bad for the environment too, because those massive fires have impacts on the airshed and the watershed. It makes perfect sense to just manage them wisely. We have to aggressively go get that. We can do that, but we're not doing it right now.
You know, I can use this perhaps as a bad segue, but it might be a segue. We're talking about our very livelihood, the fact that we aren't even allowed to do it, and that brings me to the subject of life itself, pro-life or abortion, whatever. Where do you stand on the? I'm trying to think of the right way to put this. A life issue, I guess.
There's no greater responsibility than life. And so whether it's any leadership role, whether it's within the family or within the church or within the government, we have a responsibility to protect life. Mm-hmm. And I'm a strong believer in the pro-life movement, in the pro-life position. Life begins at conception. And that is also true on the other end of the spectrum. There is dangers in the Affordable Care Act with the euthanasia argument.
Yes.
And the whole end of life argument. And there is not a greater responsibility for anyone in leadership than to protect life. And so some issues are pretty clear. That's one of them to me. That's a black and white issue, and we have to take whatever steps we humanly can to protect life.
Well, and of course that certainly ties in, as you said, with Obamacare and all that stuff. Being forced to do
If I could just put one quick commercial in.
Please do.
I'm pleased that here within the last few days and weeks, that two of the major pro-life organizations in the state, Stanton Healthcare and Idaho Chooses Life, both endorse me and have supported me, either give me an award or endorse me for work in this area. And so I feel very privileged to be recognized by that constituency.
Well, congratulations, and thank you for taking the stand.
Thank you.
Surprising how many people get a little wishy-washy when they have to address that. Another item, and we're kind of all over the map, so forgive me, but another item that is a hot-button item, and it's a big, almost a litmus test for anybody running for office in this state, and that has to do with Second Amendment, gun rights.
Yep. You know what? There are some things that are just not negotiable. The life issue is not negotiable. Second Amendment issue is not negotiable. Free market is not negotiable. Property rights are not negotiable. Those are all things that are foundational to our society. We have a divinely inspired republic, and I believe that divinely inspired republic has those components that are not negotiable. There is no society in the history of the world that has lost its right to bear arms or has forfeited its right to bear arms where it's worked out well for the people. Mm-hmm. The reason that we are constantly under attack for our Second Amendment rights is because that's a threat to government, and government is hungry for control. Yeah. And to that end, we cannot let that go, and it will continue to be under fire. This administration in Washington, D.C. right now would like to strip that entirely because it's a threat. There is a reason that our founders emboldened that Second Amendment, was just for the reason that we're experiencing today. That's not negotiable. That has to be defended.
And you've read, and I've got this little pocket constitution that I keep handy sometimes because I have to look it up again and say, what did that say? Because the latest interpretation of Washington doesn't always go with this, you know. But certainly the Second Amendment, as well as, well, the First Amendment, right to life and association, everything, they're all in there. I was remarking with one of your fellow legislators the other night when we were talking, give the devil his due. Obama, we Republicans would probably like to paint him as a failure, but actually he's been a complete success.
Oh my goodness.
Everything he said he was going to do to us, he has managed to accomplish.
You know, you're right. If someone would have told me a few years ago that he could, when I say he, I'm talking about the president and his policies, that so much progress of the left could be made in such a short amount of time, I'd have said, no way. That is not true. Here's just a quick observation of what I've seen in the Idaho legislature in the last 10 years. We as legislators used to spend time with our constituents, with one another. We would come to the Capitol for the 3 months during the session, and we would be prepared to with our own agenda. That we'd either want to change this tax policy or impact this statute or code in one way or another. But I would say about 4 years ago, Ralph, that all changed. What happened was, as we found ourselves reacting to whatever was coming out of Washington, D.C., this administration has an agenda. Yeah. They have a mission, they have a path. And so, frankly, what that has taught me and is governing my strategy as I run this campaign and as I plan for a term as governor is we as conservatives, we as Americans who typically want to just be left alone, no, we can't do that. We have to have an agenda, we have to have a vision, we have to have a strategy, we have to have meaning and purpose moving forward. That's what's driving those 4 points. We can no longer just sit back and react to whatever comes out of Washington, D.C. Our lands, we got to go get it. Our separation fiscally from the federal government, we got to go do it. Our prosperity and our economic innovation, we got to go do it. Our education system, and controlling that locally, we got to go do it. We can't just ask. We have to actively drive towards these things. We can no longer react. We have to act. We have to play offense. We can't sit back and play defense. And it's because of the aggression towards the left coming out of Washington, D.C.
Well, you know, you make a great point, and I'm going to put a dot right on top of it. We have a tendency to forget this, but the governor is the chief executive of the state. his authority, or her authority, whichever state you're in, the authority of the governor is in this state co-equal to the President of the United States. In other words, you are the leader of that state, just like, unfortunately, the person we have in the White House is supposedly the leader, and we can't be reactive. And I really appreciate your putting a fine point on that, because we have to be able to look to our governor to set the tone for the legislature and the Senate, the House, to move us forward instead of reacting, as you pointed out very, very well, as it has been happening for the last 4 years, 5 years. And even as a newcomer to the state, I look at it and I'm thinking, what happened? You know, we used to, one of the things that attracted my family to Idaho was the independence of the Idaho government, and the open. You know, I can walk into the state building and I can say, gee, I'd like to see Senator Fulcher. If he's not in session, could I see him? And almost always I could go into your door, or some, not just you because we're friends, but somebody, you know, because there was an openness. That openness seems to be closing in, and that leadership seems to have just dissipated. And I'm so glad to see that you're willing to put on the gloves and get in there, because that's exactly what we need for.
You know what? The government is supposed to be service. We are servants.
Yeah.
Now, how many? You know, by now I've traveled around the state, and I've met personally with thousands of people, one at a time. I can't recall one conversation where someone has the attitude or the mindset that the government is our servants. You know, and you know what? That's just wrong. This divinely inspired republic was created with the individual, with the citizen, and the family at the pinnacle of governance. And now that pendulum has swung into where it's the government is at the top and is acting like a ruler. Furthermore, the federal government was created to serve the states, not the other way around. And we can see how that has changed in that direction and that so-called supremacy that comes out of Washington, D.C. And so I take that very seriously. And, you know, this just popped into my mind, so forgive me for rambling, but
please.
Clark County, Nevada.
I lived there for many years. I know the
Clark
place.
County, Nevada. You know, I don't know the particulars of what transpired, but I know that family had been ranching, the Bundy family had been ranching there for prior to statehood. And where was Nevada's governor in this process? Where was their attorney general? Where was their local sheriff?
Yeah.
You know what? There's a responsibility to stand behind your people. There's a responsibility to take control of what transpires within your borders. That doesn't mean you don't cooperate with the federal government, but what it does mean is you stand and you support your people. I didn't see that. Now maybe it happened and it just didn't get portrayed in the news coverage that I saw. Yeah. But I think that there was a responsibility missed by the leadership of that state there.
And one of the things that crossed my mind when my wife and we were watching it unfolding on television, and I remember very vividly Ruby Ridge, because I was with the U.S. Marshal Service at the time. Yeah. And I thought to myself at the time, first of all, there's something very, very wrong about what's happening at Ruby Ridge, as at Waco. Yes, there were circumstances that had to be addressed, but the way they were addressed was oppressive. It was very heavy, and I thought, boy, am I glad I'm not the deputy that has to be out there on the shot. The leadership had taken a vacation, and I think we saw that with and we could talk till the cows come in about whether Clive and Bundy is correct or incorrect, right or wrong. But the point is, the point for me was that I saw this massive overreaction by government and none of the local leadership standing up to protect the interest of their constituent. He and his friends were out there alone, putting themselves in harm's way, whether they thought it was right or wrong. They were in a very bad position, and leadership was certainly missing there.
Well, all three of those circumstances that you named, the Ruby Ridge, the Waco, Texas, now Clark County, Nevada. Yeah. It's scary to me anytime a government in the United States of America draws weapons on its own.
Yes.
And if you can justify those circumstances, which I would argue are not justifiable, but for a government to justify those actions, that gives me pause to think about what truly is possible for that government. And that reaffirms the need, I believe, to stand for our Second Amendment rights, to exhibit some of that sovereignty. And I know that's a lightning rod term, but that's something that we need to remember is we are a state. We are part of the United States. I accept that. I don't dislike the federal government. They have got tremendous responsibilities. But their level of infringement on the state, I think, has been way exceeded. And it's the appetite for control, I believe, is way exceeded.